Talk a little bit today about selecting a synchronization protocol that fits your system. And the first half of this talk, I'm going to talk about the second half of the title, which is the system piece. I think that's often a little bit overlooked as we think about reproductive management and what our opportunities are in commercial beef operations. So context is really key. As we think about selecting a protocol, we really have to select it in the context of the operation, what it is we're facing, and what we're trying to do. And so before you use any tool or any technology, including synchronization, I think you have to ask some questions. And these are important. You know, does it generate an acceptable return on investment? As has been mentioned already, these technologies have a cost associated with them. And if I'm going to incur any cost in a commercial beef operation, I'm going to demand an acceptable level of return for that investment. Does the cash flow situation on the farm or ranch allow it? I think we have demonstrated pretty effectively that a lot of technologies are profitable, and yet sometimes cash flow considerations play a role in whether or not we actually take action on a profitable opportunity. Does it impact animal health and performance? Does it address the root cause of a problem, or are we just treating a symptom? Does it degrade the resources on the farm or ranch? Does it improve the resources on the farm or ranch? And then also, does it have ripple effects that are positive, or does it have ripple effects that are negative? Does it take the farm or ranch in the direction that we really need and want it to go? You have to ask those questions, and I think you have to ask them no matter what the tool or the technology being proposed is, and that applies to synchronization too. So context is key. I certainly don't have time to answer all of these questions about synchronization tonight, and I wouldn't presume to be able to answer them for your own operation. But I think many ranches and farms around the country have really realized that these things pass these context checks, and there's a lot of opportunity in use of synchronization tools. So I want to highlight this idea of focusing on the target or the aim of the system, the overall purpose of the operation, and not on synchronization as if it is a silver bullet solution to every problem that you face, because it's not. There's not a one size fits all silver bullet type of protocol for every operation in every context. And really, in a systems management approach, we are better off focusing on the quality of the overall system than we are on trying to figure out the silver bullet solution that solves all your problems. And so synchronization is not a silver bullet solution, but it's a really good tool. So what is the aim of your system? Are you aiming for example, profitability and operating the cow-calf enterprise as an enterprise? Are you aiming to increase productivity? Maybe both of those things, ideally both of those things. Are you trying to make progress towards some kind of a management goal, or maybe some type of genetic goal if you're a seed stock operation, or you can capture the value associated with elite genetics in a commercial herd? Those are all important things to think through. I often get frustrated that commercial cattle producers, partly because of the fact that livestock ownership can be a byproduct of land ownership, commercial cattle producers often don't approach cattle operations as if they are true businesses. And there are really some strong opportunities to turn cattle operations into profitable businesses, but it requires thinking about things differently and thinking about things in the lens of business management. And so I want to challenge you today with this concept of systems. W. Edwards Deming is a really influential business thinker who had a tremendous impact on Japan's manufacturing process and how it was rebuilt after World War II, and essentially took post-World War II, nuclear bombed Japan, and created a manufacturing system that was world renowned in just a few years. And he has some tremendous insights, and I'm going to share a couple of them with you before we really get into the nuts and bolts of synchronization. His point is that we need a constancy of purpose toward continually improving the system of production. And if you really think about that as a goal, I think it creates a new benchmark for what good reproductive management in cow-calf operations looks like. Because often what we focus on is a single year's profitability or a single year's productivity. And we use some kind of a metric that can sometimes be a mistake. We might use something like pregnancy rate this year, pregnancy rate to AI this year, weaning weight. And those short-term kinds of performance metrics, or even just the short-term profitability of a decision in any one year, Deming would call a disease of management, because it takes away from this constancy of purpose towards continually improving the whole system. I'm really passionate about that and have just recently completed a book that'll be out next month that is a pretty extensive collection of extension publications to serve as essentially a whole system management guide to beef cattle reproduction. We won't talk through all of this today, but synchronization is just one piece of how we manage reproduction as a whole system. This has already been touched upon by Dr. Dalton's talk, but I'm going to emphasize it just a little bit more and maybe a little bit differently. You know, if you think about a 60-day breeding season, and I've conceptualized this as a May, June, kind of a winter type of target calving date, because I realize that's what many producers around the country do, for better or for worse. Often we think about a 60-day breeding season and a resulting approximately 60-day calving season as being really good, right? Being really well managed. And I want to challenge you to think through whether we have really identified this continuity towards continuous improvement, if we think of that as good enough. So a cow that conceives, for example, on the first day of the breeding season goes on to calve on roughly the beginning of the calving season, gestation being 283 days, maybe a little bit shorter depending on the calving needs of the bull and things like that. But after calving, those cows will undergo a period of postpartum anestrus. And that is when the cow is not having normal estrus cycles. She's not having estrus cycles. She's not capable of becoming pregnant. And that will last a variable length of time depending on all sorts of management factors, her age, her body condition. It can be influenced by plane of nutrition, the presence of the calf at side. But at some point, she's going to initiate normal estrus cycles. And in most cases, this early calving cow will be cycling at the start of that next breeding season. And there had been a question in the Q&A I wanted to mention briefly on, can we talk about this calving season and what is this exactly that we mentioned? In beef cattle production systems, we're tied to the forage base because feed is not a uniform cost all year round. And when we have abundance of forage, we're typically trying to calve in some way in which we can align production demands with forage availability. And so it's really important to keep this production calendar. And if we manage in this way, we have to keep this breeding season at approximately the same time, the same year. So think through this. What about the cow that conceives on the last day of this quote unquote short breeding season? So she's going to go on to calve towards the end, if not at the very end of the calving season. Well, that same cow is undergoing postpartum anestrus. She is not having normal estrus cycles during the next breeding season, during at least a portion of that next breeding season. That's really consequential for a couple of reasons. One is that A, she doesn't have an opportunity to conceive early in the breeding season because she's not cycling, assuming we don't do anything. But B, she has fewer opportunities total to conceive during the breeding season. Now, I believe later speakers in this series will talk a little bit about pregnancy loss, or at least touch on that. We know we have some pregnancy loss occurring in cattle to a single insemination. One opportunity to become pregnant during a breeding season is not enough. Now, we have traditionally thought 60-day breeding seasons are pretty good because they result in relatively short calving seasons. But which of these two cows, if we conceptualize these as two cows, which of these two cows falls out of the herd faster? And as a result is driving up what's actually often the second biggest cost associated with commercial cows, and that's depreciation, her annual loss in value. as she potentially, becomes open and has to be culled out of the herd. So if you look at the percentage of cows failing to calve next year as a result of when they calved this year, the story is pretty telling. This is the percentage of cows failing to calve next year as a result of what portion of the day of the calving season they calved in this year. And you can see that these early calving cows are fairly unlikely to fail to calve next year, to have reproductive failure and fail to conceive during that next breeding season. But there's this stair-step relationship where the later they calve, the higher their risk of fallout. Now, I always love to show this because this is a 1958 paper. Okay, we've known about this for a long time, but this is every bit as much of a challenge as it is an opportunity. Because by moving in this direction and managing towards this continual improvement, having the calving season front loaded, having more cows calving early in the calving season, we set the stage for next year's productivity as well. Dr. Dalton showed some of this already, and I'm gonna spin it a little bit differently, but we have an opportunity, right, to get this process going with our heifer selection decisions by choosing to only keep heifers that conceive very early in their first breeding season. We can do that by either exposing heifers for fairly short breeding periods, so that they only have a certain defined window of opportunity to become pregnant. We can also do that by diagnosing pregnancy and determining fetal size and therefore expected calving date, and marketing heifers that are pregnant to calve outside of that desired window. But those heifers that conceive early stay in the herd longer. They remain in the herd for a longer period of time, and that is effectively lower depreciation costs potentially associated with heifers like that. To show you those two cows again, that's more of a cost angle. But what about the revenue side of things? Which cow brings in the most revenue, weans heavier calves, more total calves over her lifetime? It's obvious that it's the early conceiving cow, but it's sometimes not obvious just how much more revenue that cow brings in. If you look at that heifer data set that I just showed a moment ago, not only do those heifers wean a heavier calf in their first year in production, but also those early conceiving heifers go on to wean heavier calves in their first 6 years of production. So not just the first year, but the next year, the next year, the next year, the next year, the next year. And remember, they're also staying in the herd longer. If you add all that up, not only are they in the herd about 1.2 years longer, so weaning on average 1.2 more calves, but they also wean about an additional calf worth of weaning weight over that productive lifetime. So let's talk about synchronization, because again, this is just a tool to manage for this continual improvement and this hopefully progressive shortening of the calving season as we move in that direction. But synchronization is a tool, and it's a tool in your toolbox that really has the most value when you combine it with the right management system. And so it's a tool to increase the total value of calves weaned across the farm or ranch. I'm not going to go nearly as much into depreciation costs as I like to go sometimes on that topic, but that's a significant opportunity for commercial operations, is to decrease costs associated with cow depreciation, and then also decrease costs associated with all of these inefficiencies that we sometimes don't think about. Our inefficient use of labor for calving over such an extended period of time, our inefficient use of facilities that we maybe use for calving, or equipment that we use for calving. Maybe our inefficient use of all of those things around the time of weaning, if we're actually forced to wean calves in multiple groups. Here's one I bet you don't think about nearly as much. What about your inefficient use of feed resources by having cows at such different stages of production during the year? Even within these relatively short calving seasons of 60, 75 days, something like that, there's still quite a bit of variation between the cow that conceives on the first day and calves on the first day versus the cow that, conceives towards the end and therefore calves towards the end of the calving season. The topic of calving distribution has been mentioned already, and I want to show two examples. This is from an MU Extension publication that I put together that just illustrates what happens as a result of changing that calving distribution, with an example of a fairly reasonable pregnancy rate to fixed time AI, and then implementation of a fairly short breeding period, so that although we achieve a similar calving rate, the distribution of when calves are born is much more front-loaded. That has a really big impact. And I want you to know that when I did this simulation, I tried to stack the deck against the front-loaded short calving distribution because I wanted to be conservative. And I still come up with about a 10% increase in total pounds of calf weaned per cow in that type of a model. And this is, I think, using pretty conservative weaning weights as well. And so there are really some strong opportunities, as has already been mentioned, to front load the calving season. And that's why we're interested in synchronization, not just to facilitate AI and genetic improvement, but just from a commercial systems perspective. Dr. Poehler, who's a member of the task force at Texas A&M University and formerly at the University of Tennessee, did some nice work at Tennessee. And this is one of those papers that came out of that, in which the effect of shortening the calving season was looked at in conjunction with use of reproductive technologies. And we're not going to go through this, but if you glance at it briefly, what you'll notice is that reproductive technologies add value over just standard long calving seasons, but they add the most value when they're packaged in with a short calving season and the management decisions that drive towards a short calving season. So are timed AI protocols really too expensive? I want to challenge that idea a little bit. This is something that we hear a lot, right? Certainly, some of the products that we use are products that are hard to write a check for, right? I realize why it would be not too palatable to spend however much it costs on semen or a cedar or something like that. But here's another business example. Here's a quote from Brian Joyner in Fourth Generation Management, the new business consciousness. And he says that real benefits come when managers begin to understand that there's a profound difference between cost cutting and eliminating the causes of cost. I think back to an example that I heard of one business, for example, that owned a fairly large business and was large enough to actually have an employee lunch service. And they had a cafeteria, and they intentionally sold meals to their employees that were exquisite meals below the cost at which it cost them to actually produce that meal. And so it was estimated, for example, that they lost something like $2 a meal for what they sold it to at employees. Now, employees would get a great deal, right? Because they could go and have lunch for, $4 and actually effectively get a very expensive meal, because not only was there not profit margin built into it, but the business was selling it to them at a loss. Now, if you were a manager of that business, you might look at that as an opportunity to cut costs, because it may sound like a frivolous expense, but their point was that it added so much value to that company, not just from a morale standpoint, but because employees would choose to have lunch together, and they would brainstorm about things and get creative and actually add value to the overall business. So is that a cost, or is that an investment? I think that's the way we ought to think about reproductive technologies in beef herds. These are not necessarily expenses. They are investments that have some long-term profit potential, long-term return potential. And some modest expenses in reproductive management, even if that takes you, for example, slightly above an industry average expense in breeding, for example, if that increases overall revenue for the operation and also decreases overall costs, isn't that a very wise cost to incur? I think so, from a business perspective. So let's get into the protocol specifically and some of the considerations you might have as you think through selection of a synchronization protocol that fits your system and maybe what you're trying to do in terms of multi-year improvement. This is the Beef Reproduction Task Force website. It's at beefrepro.org, as has already been mentioned. And you'll notice that there's a tab at the top for protocols. Excuse me, if you click on that tab, you'll get an option to look at conventional protocols or protocols for sex-sorted semen. Now, this is what you would pull up, and I'll be honest, it's kind of complicated. I realize it is complicated if you haven't looked at that. The way these are structured, here on the left-hand side of the screen is the cow protocol sheet. On the middle portion is the heifer protocol sheet, and on the far right is the somewhat new addition to the task force suite of protocols, and that's the protocols for sex semen. These are also structured in sort of quadrants. At least the two traditional ones are, in which there's heat detection-based protocols, so protocols in which you would have to detect estrus over several days and perform AI based on detected estrus, or protocols in which you could detect estrus for maybe a reduced period of time, and then at the end perform a timed AI for animals that had not expressed estrus. There's other protocols for fixed time artificial insemination, in which you would not have to detect estrus. You could do a timed artificial insemination and schedule it out so that all of the breeding occurs at one time on one day at a pre-scheduled time. It's a great opportunity if you're going to work with a professional AI technician or a veterinarian or somebody like that to come in and do this for you. Likewise, the heifer protocol sheet's structured in a similar type of way. There's some short-term protocols for heifers and some long-term protocols for heifers. On the sex semen side of things, you'll note that there are some fixed time AI strategies recommended, and there are some other more hybrid type of approaches in which maybe there's some estrus detection or there's use of an estrus detection aid. Now, I'm not going to go one by one through these, but if you want a resource that does go one by one through these, I do have some MU extension publications that present these protocols in just a little bit of a different way. The content is largely the same in terms of how the protocols are timed, obviously, because that's based on the fundamental literature. But it's colored a little bit differently and structured a little bit differently, just a modern take on it. But it also provides some guidance just about which protocols may make sense in different cases. There's one for cows, and the link is below. There's another one for heifers, and the link is below. And again, I think those could be a resource for you. Likewise, we have one related to sex-sorted semen that, again, provides a little guidance in text form as you think about some of the decisions that you might face. And also for those of you that maybe are not ready to use AI this year, but you want to move in the right direction and move this system towards an earlier conception, an earlier calving type of system, a concentrated calving distribution, you can do some of that with synchronization and natural service. We're not opposed to that. And there are some good strategies that you can do. And often that can be a good tool to get started and get this process going in the right direction and enable you to use AI in the future. Back to that conversation of cash flow versus profitability, these can be very simple systems to cash flow. And you might think about moving to AI as you have some bull attrition out of your program and think about AI rather than investing in replacement natural service bulls or maintaining quite the same bull inventory you used to. To go back to the task force website here briefly, another great tool available through the task force website, if you click on the resources tab, you can find a synchronization planner. And that's a great tool to not only schedule out a sync program, but also you can use it to walk through the selection of a sync program. And so if you're trying, for example, to decide about whether it's realistic for you to use timed AI or perform estrus detection or the number of trips through the chute or animal handling events that you're willing to put up with for the sake of getting this done, this can help you make some of those decisions and find protocols that make sense for your operation. They'll often give you a preferred option and maybe a second or third option even to consider. So that's a great tool available through Iowa State University, also accessible from the task force website. Let's talk about the advantages of timed AI protocols in general. So protocols that enable timed AI are generally going to involve greater costs in synchronization products. Don't let that scare you necessarily, because remember, we're making an investment. And that is an investment that ought to have return potential if we're going to do it. So pencil that out and be sure that it does in your operation. I think it often will. And that AI calculator tool previously mentioned is another good opportunity to evaluate that. But by eliminating estrus detection, a timed AI protocol can significantly reduce the overall labor involved in carrying out an AI program. Often, admittedly, commercial producers, owner-operator type of settings, you might be donating your labor to the operation at no cost, and I might discourage you from doing that sort of thing. But labor does have value, and especially if you're actually writing checks for labor, reducing labor is a big concern. There are some other advantages of timed AI that we could talk about, but this is one that really comes to my mind, and that is that protocols that enable timed AI are also typically going to involve the use of a progestin product, so something like a cedar or melangestrol acetate, which is a feed additive. And those progestin products are some of our most powerful tools in synchronization systems because we can induce, to some degree, cyclicity in cows that have not started cycling again yet, and in heifers that haven't reached puberty. It's not 100% effective, but we can get a large proportion of those animals actually induced to start cycling. And if you think about that multi-year perspective of trying to move this system, continuous improvement, right, shortening that calving season, that is a big deal. GnRH can do that a little bit as well. We really think progestin protocols are often the way to go. Admittedly, they will sometimes have some greater costs associated with them, but progestins in particular are a great tool to help, again, induce that proportion of anestrus cows or prepubertal heifers to initiate cyclicity. A few general questions that you should keep in mind as you select a sync program that ideally fits your system. That cyclicity piece is probably the biggest one. So is cyclicity rate prior to the start of the breeding season a challenge? Where are you starting from in terms of last year's calving season, for example? If you are starting from a situation in which the calving season is fairly extended, you had a lot of cows calving just recently before the start of the breeding season, or maybe even it's a long enough breeding season, or it was a long enough breeding season last year that calving is still going on when this year's breeding season needs to be starting. Cyclicity is going to be an issue in those kinds of situations. Other situations that might lead to that would be poor body condition, poor fat reserves in the cattle. If you have a lot of cattle that are below body condition score 5, for example, it's pretty likely that cyclicity is going to be a challenge. So think about what the length and distribution of last year's calving season was. What's the average body condition score, and also the range in body condition scores in the cow herd? And what is the current heifer development and selection program look like? You know, if you have historically not been placing a lot of emphasis on when heifers conceive in terms of how you select heifers, and you have been selecting some heifers that will actually calve fairly late in their first calving season, you're going to face some cyclicity challenges, especially in 2- and 3-year-old cows. So identifying those challenges helps you pick a protocol that makes sense. If you have some of those challenges, investing in a progestin-based program is really probably pretty wise. The other thing to consider is whether timed AI is a priority, or whether heat detection is possible or maybe even preferred. I think it's probably rare these days that heat detection is preferred, but I realize some producers have a preference for heat detection. If heat detection is possible for you, if you can donate your labor to the operation and maybe aren't considering that as a cost, if for some reason you have some other preference that inclines you towards heat detection, maybe you don't need a protocol that facilitates timed AI, and that can be just fine. As mentioned before, though, another advantage of timed AI is that we service all of the cows at the first day of the breeding season, and that's a major opportunity. If we're just heat detecting and not performing a timed AI for cows or heifers that fail to come in heat, we don't really achieve the same thing. And so by not servicing cows, we actually often get lower total pregnancy rates, even if our conception rates look ideal. I think Dan Bush is going to talk about that in his talk next, and so I'll let him make that point. But another consideration is what type of semen, conventional or sex semen, for example, is going to be used. If you want or need to use sex semen, you need to use a protocol that is really, I'm going to say, validated or fairly well tested for use of sex-sorted semen. That's a little bit more of a sensitive product. It's not to say that you can't achieve pregnancy rates with it. You can. Often the pregnancy rates will be somewhat reduced, but you need to use a protocol that has some research results with sex semen so that you understand exactly what the level of reduction is that you might actually see with that program. If you use a protocol that's not really well suited for that, you may have results that really don't suit you. The other thing to consider is whether the goal is really maximum pregnancy rates, or whether something less than maximum is actually a little more optimum based on some other things that you're considering. You know, if if it's going to mean that you miss date night with your spouse and you miss your daughter's softball game and gosh, you break the bank trying to accomplish a certain type of protocol because you really think that it's going to achieve maximum pregnancy rates, maybe maximum isn't the goal that you need to be shooting for this year. There are trade-offs sometimes as we think about protocols. I'll show you one example just in terms of some research that we've done recently. Many of you have seen some results about the 7-in-7 sync protocol that we have made a fairly high priority research-wise in terms of our research program at the University of Missouri. Continuing to have great results with that protocol in locations around the country. I'll show you a little bit of that research here just briefly, but you can also look up that extension publication I just showed. For example, a 72% pregnancy rate to a fixed time artificial insemination with conventional semen, a 52% pregnancy rate to a fixed time artificial insemination with sex semen. And that was increased from, still very acceptable, if not great results with the 7-day co-sync plus CEDAR, a more typical protocol. That's facilitated by this large improvement in heat response that we typically get with that protocol. If you're familiar with Estrotec patches, that's what is on the back of these cows, and that red color, that activated patch, is indicating that those cows have expressed estrus prior to fixed time AI. It's pretty exciting to get that kind of a heat response in a group of cows. But just to touch on that and that idea of a trade-off, this protocol involves handling animals 3 times prior to the day of fixed time AI. So that's every week for 3 weeks, handling cattle prior to the time of fixed time AI. That leads to some improvements in our data sets, both with fixed time AI, but also with embryo transfer. But is that necessary in every single case or for every group of cows? For a later calving group of cows, a problem set of cows that are in thin condition, I would be happy to see you use any protocol that involves a progestin, and maybe maximum isn't necessarily always the goal to shoot for, and consider that sometimes optimum is acceptable. Now, what about maximum though? Let's talk about that. Make decisions with a multi-year perspective. So timing of conception during this breeding season is going to have a carryover effect on the fertility that's possible early in the breeding season next year. It's sometimes difficult to remember that we are playing a multi-year game, but we really are, right? Beef cows often don't break even, with just a single calf crop. Often it's several, and we are playing a multi-year game. And so timing of conception this breeding season has a carryover effect on fertility possible in the next breeding season. Choose a protocol you can cash flow, that you can, labor flow, if you want to use that phrasing, but it's a long-term investment. And so the counterpoint to what I just mentioned about optimum versus maximum is shooting for maximum is a pretty good idea because of the progress that it allows you to make as you move towards this continual improvement of the system. Here's some data that's already been shared, but about that concept of natural service and estrus detection and AI. I'm going to make the point in a slightly different way. I know a little bit about this data set, and these are sequential years. So these 5 years of using estrus detection and AI at the University of Missouri Thompson Research Center were then followed by 4 years of using fixed time AI. And so what's actually happening here is continual improvement as we have a commitment to the use of these technologies for shortening and shifting the calving distribution earlier. Another good example of that is some data generated by Cliff Lamb, and Vitor Mercadante was part of this research, I know, when he was at Florida for his graduate program before coming to Virginia Tech. And, if we look at the impact of using good reproductive management, it is not just a single year process. They took this herd, and these blue columns, by the way, are the years in which no improved reproductive management was done. But by using a little bit of synchronization in these green years, in that very first year of using some synchronization and a little higher level reproductive management, trying to move cows towards earlier calving, they added $87 in calf value in the dollar value during those years. $87 in calf value is a lot of calf value in a commercial operation. But then look what happens in the next year. They add a little bit more cafe. And then the next year, they add a little bit more cafe. And then the next year, a little more. And by 6 years into this, we're now adding $169 in per calf value. That is a huge amount of value. And what's driving that is this shift towards earlier calving within the calving season. So there's a lot of commercial reasons to select a sync program that fits your system and that allows you to start making that kind of multi-year improvement. If the concept of sync products is a little spooky to you, if you've never handled a seeder, you've never used MGA, you've never administered prostaglandin or something like that, I promise you, you can go read this short publication, watch some of the videos associated with it, and you'll learn in just a few minutes that none of this is all that scary and all that complicated. You can also check out my YouTube channel on or my Facebook page. It's Mizzou Repro. If you look it up on Facebook, we connect with a lot of people there, have a lot of followers on YouTube as well. And we try to post some really short content that again, can make you feel comfortable about some of these things in a pretty short amount of time. For example, here's one on inserting seeders. It's, I think, 2 minutes and 20 seconds. You can watch that and put it in a seeder just as well as any PhD reproductive physiologist does, and do a great job with that. So with that, I'm going to stop, and I'm happy to answer some questions now if we have some, and obviously can answer some in the Q&A later as well.
Thank you, Jordan. Yeah, we have a lot of questions, which is always good. So, and again, we're going to try and answer some of these live, and then save some more for the end for the Q&A. So if we can get to your question, please be patient with us, because it's hard to keep things on time. But there was a question from before that I think would be nice to, since you touched on some of those things. Can you talk about what's a regular cost of a timed AI protocol?
Yeah, I'll give you some ballparks. It's going to depend on what protocol you actually use. But let's say a 7-day co-sync plus seeder. I often talk about that as if it's the industry standard protocol, because it kind of is. That's what we see most producers use in a lot of cases, is a 7-day co-sync plus seeder with fixed time AI. Very simple, 3 handlings of cattle in total. That's a shot of GnRH, a seeder, a shot of prostaglandin, and then a fixed time AI. And most of the time that means giving all cows a shot of GnRH. So 2 shots of GnRH, let's say that's $3 per shot, that's $6. A shot of prostaglandin, let's say that's another $3, that's $9. A seeder is going to vary, let's just, for the sake of argument, say it's $12. So that brings us to $21. How much are you going to spend on semen? None of the semen reps want me to quote a price to you right now, because they want to charge you something different than I'm going to say. Let's say you spend somewhere between $10 and $50, because you certainly could do that. So let's pick 25 just for the sake of argument. That's maybe, I think I'm at $46 if I did my math right. That's $46 a head. You might have a little bit of arm service, is what I would call it, to breed those cows. That might bring you all the way up to $50 when it's all said and done. If you think that's scary, I think you need to look at the return potential associated with using AI, because that is an investment that has a lot of return potential. I'm not afraid of that breeding charge associated with cows and commercial herds at all.
There's a question about how important it is for the initial cycle to have occurred before starting protocols that have a prostaglandin shot. So for example, the 7 and 7.
Okay, that's a great question. So if we were going to use a protocol that only contained prostaglandin, for example, a 1-shot prostaglandin protocol, and then we were going to heat detect. I actually just talked to my reproductive management class about this morning, and we walked through a little bit of this math. And if I gave 100 cows a shot of prostaglandin, and only half of those cows were cycling, I would only get about 3/4 of the cycling cows to respond. I would only, get somewhere around 35, 40 cows to actually respond to a single shot of prostaglandin if half of the cows were cycling. So a single shot of prostaglandin will not have any effect in the anestrus cows. But then it will also only really be effective in cycling cows if they're in a certain stage of the cycle from day 5 and later. So a protocol that only had prostaglandin would be a problem if cows had not cycled. Now, most of these protocols, including the 7 and 7 protocol you mentioned, are actually not necessarily achieving the same type of control in every class of cow. And we might get cycling cows to respond in a certain type of way, and estrus cows get sort of caught by another piece of that protocol that still enables them to generate good fertility. And that is what happens in that protocol. We have very good effects in cycling cows, and then in anestrus cows, they're largely responding to the CEDAR and or the GnRH that's in that protocol. So they respond a little bit differently, but the protocols, that one and many others, are designed to work effectively in different classes of cows. The main advantage of, say, a 7 and 7 protocol or something that works really effectively in cycling cows specifically, you're going to realize that when you have really high cyclicity rates. If you have really low cyclicity rates, again, I just encourage you to use any protocol that's going to be effective in anestrus cows. Like a 7-day co-sync placebo would be a reasonable option.
There's a question about, days postpartum. In essence, if you're not using fixed time data before, usually when you start, you have a pretty good variation on days postpartum, right? So what would be the least or the shortest interval days postpartum that you would consider starting a cow into a synchronization program?
So I'll give you 2 philosophical ways to approach that. One would be, we could approach that as if we are trying to get the maximum conception rate in every cow. And in some cases, that may be a reasonable goal. So let's say you're a seed stock operator and you're trying to generate specific matings out of certain animals, and you get compensated largely for the genetic merit of the animal, less so for the age of the animal or the weaning weight of the animal or something like that. It may make sense to delay some cows until they're 40, 50 days postpartum, something like that, before you start a protocol. That may be very reasonable to do. In a commercial context, though, where you're largely compensated for age of calves at weaning because that it's associated with weaning weight, you may actually be better off to not try to maximize the conception rate of every individual cow and just try to do something that moves as many cows as possible to calving earlier. And so in most cases, I'm going to manage commercial herds that way, and I'm going to implement synchronization protocols even in pretty late calving cows, because it gets them moved up so that they can conceive earlier in the breeding season than they otherwise would have, calve earlier in the next calving season than they otherwise would have. It's that multi-year game that we're playing, right? So a good rule of thumb for that situation would be that any cow that is in the 21 days roughly postpartum range, go ahead and start them on a protocol, because you can often get them moved up in terms of their date of conception within the breeding season. That's a little bit aggressive. I'm not going to say that you're going to get great pregnancy rates in cows that you do that in, but if the goal is that multi-year improvement and moving them up, that's typically the way I approach it.